hello. You do it to yourself, as Radiohead sang. Well, that was certainly true of some of the subjects of our conversation today. I'm Stephen Coates. Welcome, or welcome back. I don't know about you, but I've always sort of felt that drugs or experimentation with drugs kind of began in the counterculture in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But we've discussed many times here that the counterculture itself didn't even begin in those decades, and neither, does it appear, did the use and misuse of psychoactive substances. So light up the candles, kick off your sandals, tune in, turn on, drop out for another episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. We are devoted to underground stories here, oral testimonies, hidden histories, and tales from beyond. You can check out all that we do, sign up for a bulletin, and support us in any way you can at bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks so much to those who already have. We appreciate you. And we hope to see some of you at least at the Hay Literary Festival in mid-Wales on June the 1st, when we have not one, not two, but 3 live events. Now, right back at the beginning of science, there was a tradition of scientists doing it to themselves. Isaac Newton stuck a kind of knitting needle in his eye to note the various colourful distortions that he experienced as a result. In 1767, Scottish surgeon John Hunter reportedly injected pus into his own penis to prove that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease. Ouch. Don't try that at home, kids. And they're not, by the way. Well, these are just the attention-grabbing headlines about a long tradition of scientists using themselves as the subjects of experiments aimed at the furtherance of human knowledge. But as my guest today, Mike J, has written in his wonderful new book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, that was never more true than when it came to psychoactive substances. But it was a tradition that became taboo, in parallel with a changing attitude to such substances from the end of the Victorian era, when many of them could be bought over the counter. The notion that researchers might partake of drugs and report on their experiences if they were going to have something valuable to say about them became unacceptable. Well, we're going to discuss all that and the London Psychonauts. Mike is one of our foremost historians of the psychoactive and madness. This isn't his first visit to the Bureau of Lost Culture, and it's a great pleasure to have you back, Mike. Welcome.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be back, Stephen.
Yeah, well, last time you were talking about mescaline.
That's right.
Yeah, that was one of the first shows, actually, when you came to talk about mescaline.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's a secret history of mescaline back in the day. I think we had this thing called COVID in between times. And then, yeah. And you've been busy because you've produced this extraordinary book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind. I know you don't like being called an historian, but it is a history of these people who have experimented throughout history on substances which affect our consciousness.
That's right, yeah. I grew up, I guess like most people, with the vague assumption that drugs had suddenly appeared in the 1960s. Yeah, and in fact, it turns out that if you don't have to go very far back, you really have to go back just before 1900, and then you get into a very different world. It's a world where even this word drugs that we're going to use a lot doesn't really exist at that time. And it's also a world where if you're a scientist or a psychologist or a philosopher or, a writer or an artist or whatever, then if you're interested in what drugs do to the mind, then you would, usually start off just by taking them yourself and experiencing them yourself and see what happened.
Right at the beginning of this book, you talk about in 1992, there's these two scientists, Andrew Weil, yeah, and Wade Davis, and they've basically been trying to work out this puzzle about Mexican prehistory, and there's all these images and representations of the buffalo toad, and there's an assumption that it's to do with ritual and religious processes. They're not quite sure why. And then they make this connection with another toad from the Sonoma Desert, which produces this toxin, right? But it's hallucinogenic, right? To establish this cultural, anthropological link. And they work out that actual fact there are ways of making it less toxic. If you do certain things with it, you dry it out and you smoke it. During this process, they shock horror, try it themselves. And from then on, when they write the report of it and they report what they experience on it, tell us what happens.
Well, that kind of becomes the story, the fact that they smoked this toad venom, which is seen, we're in the sort of post-Reagan sort of war on drugs era. And, this is seen as the most kind of delinquent drug fiend behavior imaginable, that these scientists would actually take this drug themselves and then write up in the report, and actually even write up in their report that, they had a pretty mind-expanding and interesting and quite pleasant experience. And, that really becomes the narrative. And what's fascinating about that for me is, about that moment, is that, as I said, you don't have to go very far back before you get to the point where scientists were doing this all the time, and yet the scientific community by the 1990s seems to have forgotten that ever happened. And then, of course, it's only a short toad hop forwards to the present day, where now suddenly these smoking these toad toxins and having psychedelic experience on them is the latest kind of thing in the sort of frontier of spirituality and wellness that taking certain drugs has suddenly become in the 21st century.
Well, we were just talking before we started, and I just talking this another article in The Guardian about ayahuasca, talking about it in kind of scientific but positive terms, and we seem to be on the brink of this reassessment of psychedelic substances. Simultaneously, nitrous oxide is just about to be banned by the British government. What are they thinking? Just drive it underground, give it back to the drug dealers, deregulate it, take away the information. Kids aren't going to stop using it. We know all that stuff anyway. So you've got this kind of prohibitions going on at the same time as this kind of new...
That's right.
Well, let's start off with the definition, Mike. What is a psychonaut?
That's a very useful word, I think. It emerges from a German novel by Ernst Junger. It's about a futuristic world where there are psychonauts, people who take novel, newly designed, mind-altering drugs to voyage around in the sort of interior space of their own mind. In the period that the book's mostly about, the 19th century, there wasn't a special word for taking drugs to explore the mind. The word that everybody used was a self-experiment. But self-experiment was what scientists did in all kinds of ways, in the 18th and 19th century, all those reckless gonzo experiments about passing powerful electric currents through themselves and severing their nerves to see how long it took them to grow back. And
who was the guy who injected his own penis with?
John Hunter.
Yeah.
Swallowing and regurgitating things to see how digestive juices worked. So actually, in that world of the self-experimenting scientists, drug experiments were not particularly remarkable, and certainly not at the more dangerous end. People did sensible things like sterilise their needles and, work their way up from small doses and obvious common sense stuff. So psychonaut's a very nice word to have. Junger, who came up with it, Albert Hofmann, who synthesised LSD in the 1930s, was a huge Ernst Junger fan. So it made its way out into the counterculture. So people these days talk about psychonauts or sort of being psychonauts quite a lot. And the way people use it these days is it's like, because within institutional science, if you're a neuroscientist or a psychopharmacologist studying the effects of drugs, you're not allowed to take them yourself. That's kind of taboo, as discussed. So psychonaut these days tends to mean someone who's a bit of a rebel or a renegade, somebody a bit edgy, a Timothy Leary or a Terence McKenna or someone working outside the frame. But I wanted to reclaim it and to use it to take us back to a time when, yes, there were rebels and renegades, of course, but there were also leading figures in science and medicine who were also psychonauts.
Here is a sidebar about the famous chemist Humphrey Davy. Davy, working with Thomas Beddoes, investigated various gases, particularly with regard to their toxicity, which he seemed often to do by inhaling them. One, nitrous oxide, he had found could be inhaled without any damaging effects whatsoever. Davy and Beddoes heated ammonium nitrate crystals in an alembic, collected the gas in an air holder from which Davy inhaled through a breathing tube. As he filled his lungs, he noticed an unexpected sensation, a highly pleasurable thrilling in the chest and extremities. As he continued, the objects around me became dazzling, my hearing more acute, and the sensations built towards a climax in which the sense of muscular power became greater, and at last an irresistible propensity to action was indulged in. Beddoes recorded that Davy leapt violently around the laboratory shouting for joy. For his own part, Davy retained only vague recollections of these ecstatic moments, and were it not for the scrawled notes he discovered the following morning, I should have even doubted their reality. As their experiments progressed, Davy realised that a new language of feeling, as he called it, was required to describe the effects of the gas. The standard question of medical description, how do you feel, was tested to its limits by a torrent of sensations that encompassed dizziness, tingling, a sense of mental exhilaration, an onrushing cosmic epiphany that rapidly dissolved into incoherence, and frequently hysterical laughter with no obvious cause. Davy and Beddoes attempted a few trials on patients with lung diseases. One responded to the question, how do you feel, with, I do not know, but very queer. Another responded obliquely but suggestively, I feel like the sound of a harp.
Yeah, it's a real sudden turn, and then quite, around the turn of the century, around 1900, because of the 1890s. We think of it as the sort of decadent era, the fin de siècle, where people were fascinated by exotic and strange experiences, and even though it's popular magazines like The Strand, whatever, were all full of stories of people having bizarre drug experiences, then everything kind of straightened up once the 20th century started. In America, it was kind of what was called the progressive era, sort of the end of this kind of laissez-faire, individualistic tendency in society, and towards something that was much more kind of socially based, and where citizens were able to group together and to come together in movements and try and change society. Which they did, of course, in many positive ways. But one of the big signature movements of that era was the temperance movement towards prohibition. And, of course, as we know, by the time you get to 1920, alcohol is prohibited in the United States and controlled everywhere else. And actually, if you go back and look at that period, alcohol is the drug that people are most worried about. But these other drugs, which start to get grouped together for the first time, start to be seen as a problem. So I think from that point on, the language around drugs changes. They're a social problem. Delinquents and criminals, they're a medical problem. There's this thing called addiction that suddenly comes along. And once they're criminalized, of course, like nitrous oxide, they become a criminal problem. That's a very different world. And it's, I think there are lots of reasons why things changed at that point. And some of them are social, and some of them are political, some of them are medical, some of them are scientific.
Jim, what hasn't changed, and I assume what has always been the case, is that most of us, want to change our state. And many of us want to change our state by using substances which have these psychic effects. I mean, that just seems to be a significant part of the human experience, is it not?
No, that's right. And across all cultures, when we talk about this, we tend to focus on, South America or the Amazon or Mexico or whatever. But we tend to assume that Western culture was drug-free because, as I said, we tend to assume that we only got interested in all this stuff in the 1960s. But of course, through the 19th century, a lot of what we now call drugs, you could just go into a pharmacy and buy, cocaine and heroin and morphine and cannabis and
nitrous oxide.
Yeah, one of the things about nitrous oxide, it always needed a bit of kit to go with it. So you tended to have people who would go around lecture halls with like sort of big dispensers of gas and kind of dispense it. So you got sort of public nitrous oxide parties and so on. But yeah, by the sort of 1900, people started to realise that, if you went into a pharmacy and you bought a little bottle of patent medicine, which was cough medicine or something like that, well, it would probably have a bit of morphine or opium in because that's good for suppressing the cough reflex, and probably have a bit of cocaine in because that dries up the nasal passages. Easily have a bit of hashish in or something else, but it had no ingredients on the packet, and people would take it, and unsurprisingly they'd feel better after taking it. And that's the sort of 1900, 1910 was the time when consumers woke up and went, hang on, what's actually in all these things? Are we being dosed with extremely dangerous, powerful, addictive drugs without being told?
And were they?
Yeah, they were. And that was the point. I mean, that was one of the big initiatives of the progressive era, was to insist on labelling. This was true of foods as well. Food was all full of all these toxic adulterants as well as medicines, and that was all, so there was a process of cleaning that all up and passing laws saying that people had to, have accurate ingredients on their bottles and so on. And the more you talk about sort of focus on the risks and the dangers of these drugs, the harder it becomes to really appreciate any positive effects that they might have. The public conversation becomes focused, as it still, is or was until recently, on the problem of these things. What are we going to do about them? Assuming, of course, that we are not drug takers, but what are we going to do about those people? So I think that's that kind of framing that we've all grown up with and we're all so familiar with. That really starts around 1900.
We're going to dive in a second, but just on that, because you do talk about, in the media to this day, if they want a drug expert to comment on something that's happened, nitrous oxide being banned or whatever, who do they get in? They get in an addiction psychotherapist, or they get in somebody who deals with drug rehabilitation. They don't get in somebody who's a regular user of nitrous oxide to talk about the experience of it, right? So they're not actually a drug expert because they don't and haven't used the drug. Now, it would be a different kind of conversation, might end up with the same results, would it not, if you actually engaged people who've used, experimented, tested the drugs and can report on the experience of them themselves, also involved in that conversation.
That's right, and that's why I've been so interested in getting back to this era where that was the thing that used to happen. But now in that sort of general, policy, media sort of discourse, if you've had the experience of the drug and know what you're talking about, that doesn't make you an expert. It makes you part of the problem.
It disqualifies you, in fact, from being able to take part in the conversation.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, you can't be trusted. Mike, let's dive in now. It's time, I think. Tell us about the experiments at the Society of Psychical Research.
This was a very interesting London scene. We know quite a lot about the Society of Psychical Research. It was a group of quite distinguished, sort of leading philosopher at Cambridge University and those things. People who were very interested in mystical experiences, spiritual experiences. They coined the word telepathy that we still use, and they used the tools of science to go around investigating seances and hypnotism and people who seem to have supernatural powers. And much less discussed, they were also very interested in the use of drugs to induce mystical experiences and out-of-body experiences. The American branch of the Society of Psychical Research was sort of steered from the beginning by William James, the great psychologist, and he, in 1882, had a go on his own with nitrous oxide. He synthesized some in a laboratory and inhaled it and had a really powerful mystical experience, which carried on fascinating him for the rest of his life. So he made contact with the Society of Psychical Research here in London. They carried out a lot of experiments. I think what's interesting about this is that, up until the middle of the 19th century, these would have been regarded as religious experiences. If you had a mystical experience or a vision, that would have been the frame that it would have been understood in. But by the late 19th century, other frameworks were available. This might be indeed a religious experience. This might be God talking to you, but equally, it might be just a mystery of the brain or it might be we need to rethink the mind and the way it works. Is there a subliminal mind or an unconscious, which normally we're not aware of, but these drugs allow us to access? Or indeed, as some members of the Society of Psychical Research thought, is this actually another dimension that you're accessing? when you huff away on nitrous oxide or ether or chloroform or one of these newly discovered psychedelics, and you pass out and you leave your body and you come back having had this experience of being like maybe on the astral plane or in some spiritual world. So all these different interpretations of what was going on became possible. And because drugs are a sort of material, physical cause, they're in many ways much more attractive to experiment with than seances or things which have so many variables, or waiting around for a spontaneous mystical experience. You can go, okay, let's try this drug at this dose in this laboratory, and then let's try it again. And
some method can be brought to it, and some predictability, which is that if you do this, if you inhale this, something's going to happen. Right?
That's
and if
right.
you inhale a bit of it, this is going to happen, and if you inhale a lot of it, who knows what's going to happen, right? But you've got some methodology and some predictability, right?
That's right. So William Ramsay, for example, was a member of the Society of Psychical Researchers, also a chemist of gases. He discovered argon and krypton and neon and won a Nobel Prize and all that. But he was also on a British Medical Association committee looking into the anaesthetic gases and what they did. And he addressed the Society of Psychical Research, saying, I've done this with all these different inhalants and solvents and gases over 50 times, he said, and I've kind of got to know the experience, and I've read my philosophy, and I've read different accounts, and I've got to a sense of this, how this goes, and I always get to this place that just feels more real to me than reality itself.
Do you know which particular gas he was talking about there?
Yeah, he was talking about ether and chloroform and nitrous oxide, all of which were used in surgery at that point, and he said they all have slightly different effects, but they basically take you to the same place, to this place that feels like more real than reality itself, and you come back feeling, wow, I've seen the secret of the universe. But
and so he'd had some insights maybe as well. So he'd basically huffed on each of these, and possibly on krypton and neon and argon as well, but not had an effect, or not had the same.
I think he was focusing on the anaesthetics there,
Okay.
because it was part of a sort of medical thing of trying to look at what these anaesthetic gases did. And so he was doing tests where he had to kind of keep inhaling ether or nitrous oxide and keep sort of shouting out numbers, or subtracting 7 from 100, or his
so there was
times were being
right,
tested.
Okay, yeah. So also some, to me anyway, surprising members of the society. H.G. Wells. I didn't actually know he was a huffer.
No, H.G. Wells was he wasn't a member of the SPR, but he was a science journalist at that point, and sort of through the 1880s and 1890s, he kept a very good eye on the scientific scene, and wrote lots of short stories, which included drugs. I think they were great for fiction writers like Wells, because they had one foot in the world of science, so they sounded kind of plausible and scientific and up to the minute. But then they had another foot in sort of the world of sort of magic and alternate realities. So you could have these. You could introduce a drug into a story, and who knows what might happen. And in fact, this is the great age of the storytellers we're in, and they're all you think of Jekyll and Hyde, and Sherlock Holmes. Drugs are a great subject for all those writers, and for Wells, they're kind of. He wrote a lot of stories about what was called double consciousness, the idea of your mind or your personality being in two places at once, and that was one of the themes that he paid a lot of attention to. And he wrote a great story called Under the Knife, about somebody being operated on and being given chloroform on the operating table, and then sort of leaving their body. This is all based on accounts, like, in magazines like or journals like the Lancet.
Just a medical journal, right?
Yes, in medical journals, doctors got interested in saying, has anybody else had strange experiences with, chloroform or ether or any of these anaesthetics? And lots of people wrote in and said, I had out-of-body experiences. And this is what Wells does in his story. He kind of picks up on all these anecdotes and shapes them into a story where somebody's, hovering up on the ceiling of the operating theatre and looking down on their body, and then kind of zooming up out of London and out. You can see the whole home counties and then the whole planet, and zooming up into space and having this huge cosmic revelation. And this is the kind of story that you could publish in, the best-selling magazines that people were fascinated to read, because, these kind of experiments and these stories about drug experiences weren't just confined to a scientific elite. They were, fascinating to the general public.
Was H.G. Wells partaking himself?
Not as far as I know. He doesn't talk about it very much. He talks a bit about his use of tobacco, but that's about it. But he writes about, hallucinogenic mushrooms as well as chloroform. He's always interested in ways in which science can unfold a world of sort of wonders and marvels.
And it's morality free at the moment, isn't it? It's still part of the great scientific endeavour, the discovery of the universe, that was progressing at speed at this point, wasn't it? With telephony and radio and photography, and even spiritualism was, anything could actually happen, anything could be true for a while.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time, and particularly sort of the mind. I mean, that's one of the reasons I sort of think this period is so interesting, is before that there was kind of this idea that, the mind was reasonable and rational, and underneath that were the instincts, that we had to kind of keep down or keep under control. And you just get from a lot of different directions in the late 19th century the idea that actually the mind is a bit more complicated than that, and the bit that we're aware of and the reasonable bit and the conscious bit are not the only bit. And there are all kinds of other bits there. And hypnosis, for example, what's going on there? People suddenly manifest different personalities. They speak in languages they're not familiar with.
Of course, Sigmund Freud was a cocaine user, wasn't he? So.
Yeah, that's right. That's an episode that I think is really fascinating and not looked at very much, because Freud himself retreated from it when it all went horribly wrong, and all his biographers kind of ignored it and minimized it. Yeah, the very young Freud, before psychoanalysis, very interested in cocaine and wrote a lot about it. And that's about what it told you about the mind, and the fact that, if it gave you all this energy, where did that all come from? Could it be that if you change your state of mind and you become kind of stimulated and positive and engaged, that actually unlocks physical energy as well? It's this period of the discovery of the unconscious and the beginnings of psychology as a discipline. First people calling themselves psychologists appearing at this point. Drugs are a fascinating and valuable tool for all these investigations. And, it's the very beginnings also of what we think of as modernism and the arts. People starting to produce experimental work that fractures our normal perspectives or sense of time and space, and, takes us into strange new realities. Not surprisingly, when you look at the roots of all that, there's an awful lot of drug experiences in there too.
Well, speaking of which, let's move on to the Golden Dawn, the occult, as you call it, the decadent milieu. Maude gone, B Yeats, and of course, fascinating Havelock Ellis. I mean, tell us about them.
The 1880s, 1890s is the great period of those occult magical societies, of which Golden Dawn is the most famous. They mostly had very strict anti-drug policies, because the people they were trying to attract were quite respectable establishment types, Freemasons and Theosophists, and, the general accepted wisdom was, well, you shouldn't dabble in drugs because you can't control them and you can get addicted and you can have a nervous breakdown and terrible things can happen. But outside the formal meetings, someone like B Yeats, who was a member of the Golden Dawn, was also associate of the Society of Psychical Research, and a member of the Rhymers Club, which was a little sort of coterie of writers. That world included quite a lot of people who used drugs, particularly Arthur Symons, who was a literary critic, the one who was most closely connected to Paris of Baudelaire and the decadent and symbolist writers. So there was quite a lot of hashish circulating in that world. But it's interesting to see how they used it, because a lot of what they were trying to do was to find ways of meditating on symbols, or sort of within sort of esoteric systems that you could use to open up your mind, your subconscious mind, and connect to spiritual influences or the astral plane. Yeats did that in his spare time, particularly with, as you mentioned, Maude gone, who was a woman he was absolutely obsessed by. Beautiful new woman, very dedicated to the cause of Irish independence. So they were both deeply into Celtic mysticism and magic and so on. And she wrote about her use of hashish and chloroform and coca, very unusually for a woman. One of the annoying things about the sort of 19th century science is, of course, it was a club of entirely white men.
Here is a sidebar about the actress, activist, feminist and mystic Maude Gonne. Here is some extracts from Mike's book about her. She was the muse and inspiration for the poet W.B. Yeats, who immortalised her in some of his most famous verses. Yeats introduced Gonne to the ceremonies of the Golden Dawn. She was eager to learn its secrets, but unimpressed by its membership. As an independent new woman and a staunch anti-colonialist, she regarded the order as the epitome of British middle-class dullness, overlaid with an English love of play acting and grand-sounding titles. Nonetheless, she absorbed some of their practices into her own magical experiments in astral travel, Celtic second sight, and with Yeats' telepathy. Gonne was an occasional user of various drugs and publicly endorsed Vin Mariani's coca wine as part of her political campaign. Your coca wine, by fortifying my voice, will allow me to make my country better known. She experimented with chloroform and found that it could help her get out of her body, but she worried about becoming addicted to it and discovered that she could achieve similar results simply by imagining and visualizing its effects. On one occasion, Gonne also used hashish, which had convinced me of the possibility of being able to leave the body and see people and things at a distance, and to travel as quick as thought, she reported. She found it effective for controlled visualization or self-hypnosis. Gonne, on hashish, visualized an indigo egg with a yellow square in the centre, her body surrounded by its spirit, merging with a red triangle. She drifted in reverie through the essences, symbols, shapes, elements and colours as the material world fell away. She created a gateway into the astral dimension. Here, elemental spirits might be encountered. They were to be greeted respectfully and with unwavering self-control. The following morning, fresh ideas and inspirations would arrive. Maude Gonne played a very important role in the struggle for Irish independence, but her colourful life also included private tragedy. Before she met Yeats, she'd begun a relationship with a right-wing French politician called Lucien Millevoye. They had a baby, George. But 2 years later, George died, probably through meningitis. As Hugh Schofield reported, over the next years, a grief-stricken Maude was drawn into the occultist and spiritualist worlds that were deeply important to Yeats. She asked his circle of friends about the possibility of reincarnation, and one, the writer and mystic George Russell, assured her that it was indeed possible to recreate a dead child's soul if the parents went about it the right way. Convinced, and having inherited a large sum of money on the death of her father, Maude paid for a memorial chapel, and in a crypt beneath it, George's coffin was laid. In late 1893, she recontacted Lucien Millevoye, from whom she'd separated after George died. She asked him to meet her at the chapel. They entered, opened the metal doors leading down to the crypt and descended a small metal ladder. And then, next to the dead baby's coffin, they had sexual intercourse. The purpose of the act was to recreate the baby's soul in the new baby that she would conceive later. By having sex next to the corpse, it was hoped that the process of metempsychosis, the transmigration of the soul, would be made easier. Now, whether the soul of George transmigrated or not might be a matter for metaphysicians, but what is certain is that in August 1894, Maude Gonne had another baby.
Within these occult explorations, what's interesting is you get a bigger range of people. You get people of colour, people from very different backgrounds. But you still had to be pretty bold and brave as a woman to write about your drug experiences in those days. If you cared at all about your reputation, you were making yourself a hostage to fortune.
Probably wouldn't have been taken seriously as well in the same sort of way.
That's right, yeah. In the same way that women weren't taken seriously as scientists, they weren't seen as objective enough or whatever. And that little coterie is also where the first psychedelic experiences in Britain take place, with what we now regard as major psychedelics. In 1897, when W.B. Yeats and Arthur Symons were off in Paris doing their thing. Havelock Ellis, who you mentioned, was staying in their apartment, which is in Fountain Court in the Temple District, one of those lovely little courtyards just off the Strand. And he'd read about peyote, this hallucinogenic cactus, and managed to get hold of a sample and spent amazing day and an evening on peyote, having sort of a wonderfully rich visual aesthetic experience and writing it up in enormous detail. And then when Yeats and Symons came back, he gave them some peyote, and there was a little circle there of sort of psychedelic experimentation way back in the 1890s, long before we think of that sort of thing as starting.
He's worthy of a whole show by himself, isn't he?
Yeah,
Havelock
he
Ellis.
is.
I mean, tell us a little bit about him, because he was this extraordinary character.
He's remembered most now for his studies of sex that he wrote and co-wrote. He was the first person really to write scientifically and non-morally about homosexuality and so on. He was pioneer of all sorts of socialist thinking and free thinking. He had elaborated this wonderful progressive vision of society at that time. He was also a doctor, so he wrote up his peyote experiments for the Lancet, for the medical crowd. Did a lot of writing as an art critic, more broadly a cultural critic. That's what's so fascinating about the way he writes up his peyote experience. He almost writes it up as if he's been to an art exhibition. He's kind of critiquing these visions that he's getting. He's trying to describe them, and he's saying, it might look like, have you seen those beautiful Maori carvings? It's a bit like that, or, that sort of beautiful, in Morocco, you can see that lovely filigreed sort of lacework and tile work. He had this enormous frame of artistic and cultural references to draw on. And that was the way psychedelics first appeared. It was not a spiritual experience. It was not like a medical thing. It was certainly not trying to morally assess whether this experience was good or bad. He was just immersed in it.
It was an aesthetic thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think he was a true countercultural figure, right? And in some ways, it sort of represents one pole of the psychedelic experience, which happened in the counterculture of the sort of 60s and 70s. He sort of got it all, hasn't he, really, there?
I think he has, and I think the psychedelic experience is an intensely aesthetic experience for people. And these days, we don't talk about it like that. People want to know, what does science say about this? What's it going on in our brain? Is it good for therapy?
What does art say about it? What's the aesthetic aspect of it? Just to take it back to that, right?
Yeah,
Let's not try and see it as a way of getting more productivity by microdosing acid, or even actually coming back from the brink through therapy. What about just as an aesthetic experience? Maybe that's enough.
I think that's right. And I think in a way, I mean, ever since the word psychedelic was coined, people use it to describe, mostly, a visual aesthetic sound as well. But there's a whole idea of what psychedelic is supposed to look like, and it's all lots of oversaturated, swirly, clashing colours. I mean, I don't know about you, but my personal psychedelic experiences don't look very like kind of what psychedelic art is supposed to be.
Not mine, sadly. But I mean, you're going to get psychedelic cheesecake soon, aren't you? It's becoming back on brand, isn't it? But another character who you talk about, who I'd never heard of, is absolutely fascinating, is James Lee.
James Lee's a fascinating character. I've been on his trail for a long time, ever since I came across his book, which is a memoir called Underworld of the East, which he wrote in his retirement. What's so fascinating for him is he's so recognisable from our sort of modern, drug counterculture perspective. And he's very much outside the loop of all this drug literature in the 19th century. Everybody's read De Quincey, everybody's read Baudelaire, everybody knows how this is supposed to go. But James Lee doesn't appear to have done. I mean, he's a working class figure. He's from Teesside. He's an engineer and a draftsman. Through the 1890s and 1900s, he has a whole succession of jobs out in the the colonies, mostly working on sort of mines and railroads and being an engineer on these kind of projects. And he says he just found life in London so dull. He wasn't interested in sport or anything that everybody else was interested in. He wanted to have an interesting time. And his first posting was out in Assam in northeast India. And very quickly he notices that the people in the mine he's working with are all chewing betel nut, and they're all taking hashish. And he meets a local doctor there, and when he gets a bit of malaria and fever, the doctor gives him some morphine and a needle and shows him how to inject it. Then he finds that his dose is going up a bit and wearing off, and so his doctor gives him some cocaine. So he starts kind of, taking cocaine and morphine together, and finds that you can use them, each one of them, to taper the dose off the other. And then he gets fascinated by hashish and kind of getting really, really high, and realizes that, if you take huge doses of hashish and then you can also sort of inject yourself with cocaine, and you can get into the state where you're pretty much having, virtual reality hallucinations in front of you all the time. And he writes all this stuff. He's very practical, being an engineer. He's very interested in these experiences. They become, his favorite thing. And he wants to know how you can keep on doing them, and why some people get into trouble with drugs and how not to. So he's full of hints and tips. William Burroughs was one of the sort of first people to rediscover James Lee's book, and he absolutely loved it. And you can see exactly why. And because James Lee is that sort of perfect Burroughsian countercultural figure, but there he is, back in the 19th century, doing this pretty much on his own. There's no kind of real scene around that he's doing it with. He's fascinated by drug scenes, drug haunts, as he calls them, opium dens and other places. And he wanders around Sumatra, where he has a posting in the jungle, asking local people to provide him with any samples of intoxicating plants, and keep discovering these strange new drugs.
Here is another sidebar about the psychonaut James Lee, as described by Mike in his book. Sometime around 1910, James Lee returned from Southeast Asia to Britain, this time bringing his Indian wife Milky with him. As usual, he detoxed from cocaine and morphine during the voyage with his practiced method of reduction. He was en route to a new assignment as engineer for a West African gold mine and decided to take a holiday in London. He found drugs easy to come by and was soon pretty well lit up by frequent doses of cocaine, morphia and cannabis. Normally he stayed indoors when on large doses of drugs, but on this occasion he took an evening stroll down Piccadilly. The people around me seemed to be abnormal in every conceivable way, he reported. Some would appear to be about 10 feet high, while others would appear to be microscopic. All the time, there were spirit-like shapes floating around me, constantly coming and going, and being replaced by fresh ones. I strolled along, seeming in fairyland. I was in an intense condition of happiness, without a single care in the world. I seemed to be walking on air. Lee mused on his hallucination as he walked back down Piccadilly, under a blaze of light from illuminated signs and brilliantly lighted shop fronts, the pavements crowded with well-dressed people bent on enjoying themselves. He was interrupted in his reverie by a young girl, whom he immediately recognised as a cocaine user with dilated pupils, an exhausted expression, and a pathetic little droop, like that of a tired child. He accepted the invitation back to her flat on one of the back streets behind Shaftesbury Avenue, where he asked her how long she'd been taking cocaine. She pretended innocence until he reassured her that he'd been using it for years. She expressed astonishment at his good health and explained his regime to her. He asked to see her syringe and inspected the leather washers and the screw caps. "Do you ever take it apart and thoroughly clean it with carbolic or sublimate?" She didn't. Her system was becoming poisoned by septic matter, while her vitality was being quickly sapped by loss of sleep and lack of adequate nourishment. He left the girl with a schedule of instructions to follow and never saw her again. It was a salutary reminder that not everyone embarked on their drug careers as well prepared as he had been, and that a new generation of drug habitués was growing up beyond the reach of both the law and medical expertise.
He's almost like a He's a figure from our own times in a way. He strips away all that kind of moral layer of conversation that built up in the 20th century and gives us something that's much more like what you might read on a drug website or something online today.
I mean, he is the kind of, in a way, it's like the archetypal psychonaut in some respects, isn't he, from that point of view? Amateur, I mean, informed amateur, but he's actually sort of investigative, immersive. He's doing it himself. He's not just observing other people doing it. He's reporting back.
Yeah, I mean, he's...
You know, good and the bad, and sort of providing information about how to navigate this landscape of psychic states.
Totally self-taught. He sees himself as a pioneer. He doesn't know anybody else who does this, and he's got his sources of information. One of which is sort of Western medicine that he gets mostly through Indian doctors, and another of which is like local people. You know, he's not one of those sort of colonial figures who hangs around in sort of English club houses. He kind of avoids all other English people because he finds them a bit dull. So he's got various sources of information, but his main source of information is his own experiments, and he starts to take them more seriously and kind of log the doses and the times and doing it all properly scientifically, but in a self-taught way.
Then this pivot comes that you talked about, this kind of morality pivot. But actually, of course, the figure who you talk about too, who is of this next era, of course, who became another very like poster boy. Boy's probably the wrong word. Poster beast for the for the counterculture is Aleister Crowley, right? Who he writes the Diary of a Drug Fiend. You know, he's public about his drug use, but he's public about it in a provocative way to establish his credentials as anti-establishment, sort of reveling somewhat in the scandal. It's a flag for his transgressiveness, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this word drugs that we throw around now didn't really make any sense in the 19th century because it was like, most of them you could buy in a pharmacy. Some of the sort of things that surgeons and doctors used. There were other things, like Havelock Ellis's peyote that you get mail order from some herbal company. These didn't, these weren't a separate category. But and then you start to see things like sort of dangerous drugs or inebriating drugs or addictive drugs. And then it's gradually about 1900, you start to see people dropping that adjective and drugs just comes to mean this set of substances, mostly opiates and cocaine. Hashish, not so much at this point. Yeah, then there's a very sort of strong spiritual, progressive, environmental movement in the 1910s and 1920s. By and large, it's not about drugs. The people who are interested in sort of spiritual evolution and spiritual growth regard drugs as a kind of rather gross thing that's sort of pumped out by big industrial pharmaceutical companies and that just sedate and stupefy people and stop them from waking up. So, at this point, if you're a sort of progressive cultural figure, you almost always dissociate yourself from drug. I think this is where Aleister Crowley kind of made himself deliberately very distinctive. He was younger than the Golden Dawn lot, Yeats and so on, when they were doing their peyote and hashish, he was still in school. So he comes along in a later era and embraces drugs as a part of his magical tradition, whereas people like MacGregor Mathers and the Golden Dawn didn't want to frighten the horses. That wasn't the image they wanted to project. And Crowley it is. He talks very beautifully about how the drugs like hashish loosen the girders of the soul. These are things that allow you to shake off the rational and your social self, drill deeper, find these kind of interior worlds within yourself and these spaces that you can, using magical practices, you can control and harness, and they become sources for magic.
I mean, he writes very beautifully, actually, about his drug experiences, doesn't he, quite often? But he also revelled in the fact that he was a fiend, didn't he? I mean, he wasn't just that, he was aware of the sort of scandalous aspects of it as well, right? And he kind of enjoyed that.
He did. This is just about the time when you start to get the beginnings of what you might call a drug subculture properly. And I think that's because in the 19th century, there were little circles of drug takers, but there wasn't kind of a unified subculture because people were just going to the chemists or whatever and buying their drugs and doing this in private. It was once they were criminalised, after the First World War, that if you wanted to do drugs, you had to go to Soho or to Chinatown or to this pharmacy where you could get it under the counter. And that's when you start to get a subculture emerging, because drugs have been driven underground. So the people who use them become kind of a unit, a scene, a subculture. And Crowley was actually not very keen on identifying himself with that. He was sort of youthful, ignorant thrill seekers. He was very scornful of,
Well, he's also incredibly pompous, wasn't he? And he's also incredibly elitist. So, for instance,
that's
he
right.
definitely thought that those sort of experiences were sort of for the few.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
The people that he approved.
Yeah, and he was a sort of
masses.
hyper-individualist. That was a phrase that was used quite a lot at that time. People who weren't getting with the program of kind of being progressive and social, selfish, egotistical people pushing themselves first, hyper-individualists. That was very much what Crowley was. He was a proud hyper-individualist. But this was a time when drug users, even though they were being described as individualists, they were also starting to be seen as a group, because part of the way that science and data were being used at this point was to define and classify people a lot more. So once you had all these actuarial tables of insurance, you could see that people who drank heavily, had worse chronic diseases and worse health and died younger than other people. So you started to get this category of drinkers and then this category of drug users, who were never would been a category before, because drug users in the 19th century were, well, often, the stereotypical drug user was some sad widow on her own too much, taking a bit too much morphine, or
a mother trying to keep the baby quiet with some
That's
laudanum,
right.
Yeah.
But suddenly you had this idea of a drug user who was a sort of delinquent, criminal, sort of teenage young man or whatever. All drug users start being lumped together, and of course that was something that Crowley resisted, because he was not like them.
But it does sort of take us full circle in a way, doesn't it? Because you make this point in the intro to the book about drug culture, which is nearly always used in a pejorative way, isn't it? Right, drug culture. And yet, look what happened with drug culture just in the 1960s. I mean, never mind in the times that you were talking about, but I mean, it was responsible for a huge flowering of music and art and thinking. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates put down their sort of first breakthroughs to the use of acid. I don't want to get into a kind of, hey, drugs are good, because of course they're not good as well. There's the dangers of, I've just been talking to Barry Adamson, who's a heroin addict for 10 years. Peter Coyote a couple of weeks ago, also a heroin addict, and you sort of... A digger, and you're sort of aware of actually, and the new drugs on the street, the synthetics and stuff, the devastating consequences that they have, but often tied up with other issues to do with big pharma and to do with prohibition itself, with lack of information, lack of availability of what people really want. It's a very complex area, but I think this book, you could say it's preaching to the converted, but it sort of establishes or re-establishes the importance of the other side of the conversation, and that side of the conversation was being had. And just as drugs were prohibited, that side of the conversation was prohibited.
Exactly that. Just by giving it a longer historical range than we normally do, by taking it back into the 19th century and sort of back to the beginning, then you can see this pendulum swing much more clearly. The late Victorian time was people were very concerned about drugs, but they were also really intoxicated by all their possibilities, what we were learning about the mind and how they were going to help us, create amazing societies in the future. And then at the very end of the book, I sort of jump forward 50 years from there to, what we I think of as the psychedelic era, the 50s and 60s, when you see the pendulum swinging back again and people getting interested in interior experience again and mystical experience and a sort of more positive idea of human possibility and the idea that drugs might not just be a problem, they might also enable us to sort of open up and expand our horizons and glimpse possibilities that we couldn't without them. So we've got these two cultural conversations going, and even during our lifetime, as you said, in the 90s, it was the idea that scientists might take drugs kind of seen as taboo and a terrible thing. And now, we just look around and we're in this world where barely a day goes by without some new scientific report saying, we've done a brain scan on this or a survey on that, and we've discovered that drugs help people with X, Y, and Z, So I think this, looking at it in this longer frame, we can see that, there are two different sort of ideas of modern life here, really. And in one of them, drugs is a danger and a problem and something that has to be suppressed. And then the other, it's an escape hatch to all kinds of future possibilities.
The astonishing thing really in the debate that gets going on at the moment, or the question not asked, is that why do people want to take drugs?
Yeah,
so
right.
Many people want to take drugs, and what happens when they do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The scientists, why aren't they asking that question? The biggest question about them is, what are these experiences? It's a bit like, really, we haven't made much progress on the subjects of consciousness or dreams, for instance. We all sleep every night and have strange experiences, and we don't really got into it that deeply. It's this huge area of human experience that remains kind of out of reach. And of course the same prohibitions going on, the same old debates with politicians trying to please a small shrinking group of the electorate, by banning things and criminalising more young people.
But yeah, that's right. That's what I've always tried to do, and that's really the sort of driving force of this book, is trying to put the experience in the centre.
And the aesthetic of it as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Finally as well, this psychonautic tradition, this self-experimenting and reporting tradition, was kind of prohibited in the way that the drugs themselves were prohibited. And it went underground in the way that the drugs went underground, because you said you first got interested in all this stuff with the advent of the internet, when all these message boards sprung up with people talking about their drug experiences, and this went into big sites like Erowid, where people were reporting and analysing the experience and sharing knowledge about dosing, risks, symptoms and experiences and stuff. It actually carried on going on, didn't it? It's amongst a group of people who carried on sharing the information amongst themselves in a kind of countercultural underground way.
Very much. And they're sort of people who these days would quite often call themselves psychonauts. And that's, when people talk about, why it went underground in the 60s, everybody always talks about, Tim Leary and the hippies and everybody got spooked. And sure, it's partly that, but it's also partly about the rules of the game changed in terms of testing medicines and pharmacological compounds and getting licensing from the authorities for them, and that all became about objective measures and large cohort trials and data, and subjective experience disappeared from that. What we're always talking about with mind-altering drugs is, they alter the mind, they alter the consciousness. It is a subjective experience. So if you're trying to do the science without having the subjective experience, you're always trying to do it at second hand. Yeah, right from the 60s on, scientists, chemists, underground chemists, people working outside the scientific mainstream, they carried on taking these drugs. They synthesized new drugs and reported the effects of them. And in doing so, they kind of returned to a tradition that had been, going on since the 18th century. The sort of one of the first episodes that I really write about is Humphrey Davy, the chemist, and his experiments with nitrous oxide, which he undertook with the Romantic poets Coleridge and Southey and so on. And when he published his report on that, he described the chemical synthesis in great detail. Then he said, well, that doesn't tell you anything unless you also know what these things do. So here are my descriptions of, by me and my friends of the experience. And then when the underground chemists got going in the 60s, they did the same thing. Alexander Shulgin, probably the most famous one, published his big book of chemical recipes with exactly the same structure. Okay, here's the chemical synthesis, and now here is my description of the effects. We're in this odd position now where people are fascinated by subjective experiences and these inner experiences and what the psychedelic experience is. Science can only give us sort of second or third hand markers, sort of brain scan this or neurotransmitter that. And what we really want is to hear what it's like, what it feels like, what the experience is.
Mike, thanks for coming back to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Absolute pleasure, Stephen.
Thanks to Mike. It's a complicated area, isn't it? I mean, the war on drugs is obviously nonsensical and doomed to failure. It's just put huge power and resources in the hands of the underworld. And science on the subject is still mainly ignored by politicians and policymakers. I mean, in the UK at least, they seem to be much more concerned to appease a sort of dwindling number of uber-conservative voters. In the past, I've got to admit, I've been for the legalisation, or at least decriminalisation, of all drugs, information rather than legislation. I believe in the personal sovereignty of one's consciousness. I don't want our Home Secretary, or whoever it is at the moment, telling me what I can and can't do in the privacy of my own head. But it is difficult when it comes to some of the new synthetics and street opiates and vulnerable people. But I think the message I picked up from Mike's book really is to expand the conversation in the way that the psychonauts that he talked about did. For scientists and artists and writers, thinkers, medical practitioners, philosophers, yes, even politicians, to engage with each other around the actual experience in an attempt to answer the question, why have us humans sought, wanted, needed to change our state throughout history? And what's the potential good as well as the potential harms of doing so? Do check out Mike's book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind. It's published by Yale. It's terrific. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Thanks to you for listening. I wonder what your experiences in this area have been. You can check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com, including upcoming events. Sign up for our bulletin. Now, do us a favour, do me a favour. Leave us a review in Apple Podcasts if you listen to this programme that way, or write to us and tell us what you think. It's great to hear from countercultural friends. Stay safe. See you next time.